We're going to be talking about politics in modern Islam and how that opposes the concept of nation state and why it's a challenge to the concept of nation state and why that is so very important. What we're trying to do here, especially in this community that we have here, is to protect the world liberal order as it was created after World War One and especially after World War Two. This system is how we have all the great progress and scientific achievements and stability in economic progress all around the world. All the everything that we defend, which is basically classical liberal values or basically less Western Enlightenment values. There are so many names for this. All of this was just theory before the French Revolution. They only became possible after World War II. So we had a world order that made all of this possible. That's why we have to look at everything that challenges that framework. These ideas are just ideas unless you have a framework where you could keep it in and execute them, or else just they're just philosophical ramblings of people in academia. When it comes to actually enforcing it, there are two phases when it came to these ideas being implemented. The first one was the French Revolution and then the American Revolution, which actually saw many of these ideas being put into practice. And then we saw the Western world progress much faster than everyone else because of it. Where the Western world became superpowers of the world, especially America, which was the birthplace of these ideas being put in place. So that was from the French Revolution and the American Revolution up until World War II. And World War II is when, because United States basically having the upper hand after the World War II, it managed to, and European nations managed to put that system in place all around the world. So ever since World War II, what we have is that model of nation states everywhere in the world, which actually does explain the rapid rate of advancement in everything from science to technology to healthcare to reduction in poverty to access to clean water to education to basically everything is getting better at such a fast and rapid pace. So anything that stands against the concept of a nation state as a way to organize and manage politics around the world is a danger to the current global order. We basically have to do everything we can to protect it. The world hasn't seen this much stability and growth for the past 12,000 years of civilization. This is a very unique situation that we are in right now. And many of us don't understand how unique this is because we're born into it and think that this is just forever, and it's not. So we need to do everything we can to protect it. And one of the ways to protect it is to understand what threatens it. And that's what this is about. Why is the politics of Islam one of the main enemies of this new modern world order? It starts with World War One. I think a lot of you know that we had this empire called the Ottoman Empire, which is the last remaining form of an Islamic caliphate, right? So Islamic caliphate is basically how Sunnis rule Islamically. Caliph in English basically means successor or Janashin, comes after Prophet Muhammad and rules in his place. So Muhammad ruled the city of Medina or Yathrib, what was known before Medina, Yathrib. And then after his death, everybody, and according to Sunnis, anybody that ruled the Islamic community was considered Caliphate or Caliphate in English. The Ottoman Empire was the last remaining version of that. So originally we had Muhammad, and then we had the rightly guided one, or the Rashidun, or like Abu Bakr, Omar, Osman, and then after and Ali, and then after that we had the Bani Umayyah or the Umayyad dynasty, and then we had the Abbasid dynasty, and then it kept on going, and then the last one was the Ottoman Empire or the Ottoman Caliphate. In World War One, that was the end of it. The Islam's spiritual empire was destroyed. A lot of people don't understand how big of a hit this was to the Islamic community. Not having a caliph in power is unprecedented in Islamic history. Because we're born in a world that doesn't have that, we think this is the norm. This is not at all a norm in Islam. And that's why when it comes to what people refer to as Islamists, and we will come back to this word and whether or not this word has any meaning, when somebody is an Islamist, they want to go back to that. They want to create a single global, and they actually want to achieve more than what they had. So what we had before was the Islamic Empire or Caliphate. But now, if you look at Islamists, they want to bring that back and go farther, which is to get into a single global Islamic empire that dominates the entire world. So, what happened in World War One after the defeat of the Ottoman Empire? We had Western colonial borders put in place. The most famous agreement that created that is the Sykes-Picot, which is makes a lot of Muslims angry, a lot of Islamists angry, and we'll get to what that is and why. Let me know in the chat, guys, if you have heard about this, the Sykes-Picot Agreement, because here a lot of you know about the Balfour Agreement, and there are so many different agreements. Like, do you know? Okay, so people in the chat are saying no. All right, so Sykes-Picot is something that I want everyone here to become very familiar with because this is the root of everything that modern political Islam is fighting against. This is actually the root. So that's one term that we need to be familiar with. And Qutb, have you heard of Qutb? This is a person that we have to become very familiar. And again, this is something that we will do more webinars to become familiar with this person as well. So let's actually go step by step about what happened. So let's go to World War One, which is between 1914 and 1918, right? And this war reshaped the Middle East politically, socially, demographically, and it did all that mostly because it ended the Ottoman Caliphate, which lasted for 600 years before it collapsed. But the Islamic Caliphate lasted for much longer. It lasted for 1400 years, and this was an end of an era. It was basically the end of Islamic Empire happened in World War II, in World War One. This is basically for Islam, this is like the fall of Rome, or basically the end of the Roman Empire. That's how significant this is for Islam. If you were a Muslim at that time, it almost seemed like Islam was basically just defeated. Oh, somebody's saying, can you write the term? I want to research it. Okay, I will put it for you in the chat. Okay, so it's in the chat if you want to research it. Right. So let's paint a picture. World War One. On one side, we have Britain, France, and Russia. On the other hand, we have Germany, Austro-Hungarians, and the Ottoman Empire. Okay. So the Ottoman Empire was on the side of Germany. One thing that made the British, French, and Russians very worried was the Berlin Baghdad Railway, which was a major cooperation between the Germans and the Ottoman Empire. And this really threatened the British because they saw this as a major threat because it threatened the British access to India. And so basically they will not have it, right? So there was an agreement on September 4, 1914, a pact to make peace jointly. And this agreement, it was called the Sykes-Picot Agreement. And this was an agreement on how to divide the Ottoman Empire lands and the Ottoman Arab lands. The Ottoman Empire was Turkish, right? It wasn't Arab, but it held many Arab lands. It held much of the Hijaz, the areas that we know today as Syria, Lebanon, Iraq. These were Arab land, you know, Persian Gulf, Arab countries that we recognize today. All of these were under the Ottoman Empire, and they controlled this. And the Sykes-Picot Agreement was basically the agreement on how to divide these lands. If you look at the borders of many countries that have a longer history, you can see their borders are not straight lines. But if you look at the map of these countries, you can see a lot of straight lines on the map. The reason why these lands are straight, you know what I'm talking about, right? If you go into the Middle East, if you go on Google Map and you could look at the lines of the borders of these countries, you could see really straight lines, like going from for a very long distance. If you look at the border between many other countries, you don't see such straight lines. The reason these lines are so straight is because they were drawn so artificially and quickly without going in and really researching. I mean, I don't want to, we don't want to really blame the Europeans that much for drawing these lines, because at the end of the day, the fact that they were doing this was still progressive for its time, because they were anti-colonial. So we were basically moving away from the age of empires to the age of nation states. A lot of people blame the British, for example, for drawing these borders very poorly, but they don't give them credit for wanting to give these people their own nation states, because that was not normal. Like every time an empire fell, the areas that belong to that empire will now be absorbed by another empire. But now what we're seeing here is that instead of new empires trying to own, they still had a lot of control, but it was less control than before. They were trying to maintain a lot of influence in these areas. They were also giving people their own nation state, right? This is an era where Western countries have already transitioned out of empires and into nation states. And they were basically bringing this to the Middle East and trying to allow these people to also have their own nation states instead of becoming part of like the British Empire. The transition cannot be really that fast. It's going to be messy. The borders will be not perfect. Obviously, these countries will not be as modern and as progressive as they are today. But we have to acknowledge that it was much more progressive than just coming here. Well, this was the Ottoman empires, now it's the British Empire. So people always want to blame the British for some of these borders, but they don't remember that it was these countries that decided to give these countries their own independence and their own power over who are the representative and to determine their own destiny. Local people having the right to determine their own destiny was a modern concept in the making at that time. Muslims were not familiar with this idea, right? Because back then we were still dealing with the age of empire, but many Muslims there also were influenced by Western thought and were becoming nationalists. And the nationalism that was being, so we had influence from the West. Communism was growing, nationalism was growing, but also ethnic nationalism and fascism was also growing in the Middle East, all of them coming from the West. So good ideas and bad ideas were coming to the Middle East and getting mixed with Islamic ideas as well. It's a mess of ideas mixing with each other, right? One thing other than, so before we talk about pan-Islamism, we also have to acknowledge that Pan-Arabism was created during this time. People were noticing that there's another way of doing politics than empires. And Pan-Arabism was something that was born out of this in the Middle East, which was very similar to basically Nazism, just replace Aryans with Arabs, and then you get Pan-Arabism. But we will come back to that again. But let's also talk about Pan-Islamism. So the Pan-Islamic view is basically the idea of this whole nation state, this whole concept of nation state is Western invention, and they brought it here to take away the caliphate from us. So when we say caliphate, you have to understand that's an imperial idea. Like a caliphate is an empire. So when we say pan, just remember pan mean like when I say pan Islamist is somebody who wants to create identity and a unity and a geographic block based on Islam. When I say pan Arabism, it's basically all of that, but instead of Islam, it's based on being Arab. Right? So we have Pan Arabism. For now, you just have to focus on these two, Pan Islamism and Pan Arabism. So Pan Arabism means that we want to create an empire, and our point of unity is going to be that we're Arab. This is an ideology that is against Pan Islamism. against pan-Islamism. So if you are a pan-Arab, the empire that you want to create will not include black Africans, Pakistanis, or Indonesians. You do not consider them as part of your community. It's very much like Nazism, right? We want to create an empire based on our Arab identity. And in fact, many pan-Arabists are not only not very Islamic, but many of them were socialists and secular, very secular and socialist, right? Pan-Arabists, right? Pan-Islamist is basically the idea of we want our caliphate back. All right. We want, and their identity, their community, the Ummah, is not based on being Arab, it's based on being Muslim, and they want their caliphate back. Both Pan Arabist and Pan Islamist want to get rid of the idea of a nation state because both of them are empires. A caliphate is an Islamic empire, and the Pan-Arabists will just want to basically create an Arabic bloc. And by the way, Pan-Arabist is something that is we are by the death because but after the death of Jamal Abdel Nasser, the Pan-Arabists are much weaker right now and they don't have much power. It's mostly Pan-Islamism right now, but we will get into that. If you want to ask questions, ask short questions so I could read them quickly. Okay. Oh, thank you guys for guiding the people in the chat who don't have idea. Okay, let me go through this. I will try to get to that once. I will let you know what the Pan Arabists were used to be a big deal before, like the PLO, for example. We'll get to that. So let me give you a short understanding of the Pan Islamist view. They think the abolition of the Caliphate is a Western plot to destroy the Muslim Ummah. So, what is the Ummah? Ummah is basically the entire global Muslim community. That's what the Ummah is, right? And their conspiracy theory is that the whole point of abolishing the caliphate was to stand against the Islamic. They took it very personally. They think this was the West's idea to fight against Islam, but there is, I mean, the actual thing is that your empire stood on the losing side of the war with the Germans, and then your empire fell apart. That's what happened. You were just on the losing side. But they took it very personally. They think that this whole project was for the purpose of destroying the Muslim Ummah. And some scholars describe the Ummah without a caliph. So let me actually define these terms. So Ummah is the entire Muslim community, global Muslim community. The Caliphate is the Sunni Islamic Empire. We will talk about what the Shia version of all of this is on a different webinar, right? The Caliphate is the Shia Islamic Empire, and the Caliphate is the successor of the Prophet or one who rules after the Prophet. And that's the position of the emperor of the Islamic Empire. They would use the words caliphate and caliph, but those are basically equivalent. And so this is how some scholars describe this. They say the ummah without a caliph is like a body without a head. So right now we don't have the caliphate anymore, but we still have the ummah. And the ummah is the entire Muslim ummah globally, everywhere they are. It feels to many Islamists that all of the Muslims around the world are like a headless body walking around, and they want to go back to recreating what they had before. This is very dangerous because going back to what they had before is basically going back to the age of empires. If you are on the side of classical liberal values, the framework for all of this is the idea of a nation state. This is why nationalism, not fascism, but nationalism, is an important part of classical liberal values because none of this would be possible without this framework. So anything that is a threat to the concept of a nation state, we should be taking seriously. For example, this is why when Putin is trying to bring the Russian Empire back, we should be very concerned because any form of empire building is a threat to the framework that makes it possible for all of these ideas to be practiced. So, yes. So saying it's like Christians without the Pope. No, it's not like that, because Christianity without the Pope is not going to suffer as much. Christianity hasn't introduced the idea of Christianity being there to rule, right? Just guys, remember Jesus. If you read the story of Jesus, he never ruled, right? Jesus never ruled. But if you look at the story of Muhammad, Muhammad ruled, right? And we have also Quranic verses that introduces the idea that Islam needs to rule and take over. We don't have something like that in Christianity. But the main person that we have to understand here and study, and we will do that in our future webinars in this community, is Sayyid Qutb. And we will spend a lot of time in future webinars talking about this man. Okay, Sayyid Qutb, which is basically, I mean, Hassan al-Banna before him, but then Sayyid Qutb is the reason why we have Muslim Brotherhood. Okay, he might not be the father, but he's pretty close to being the father of what we know today as Muslim Brotherhood. We will come back to this man over and over again in our discussions. And he's the person that reintroduced the Ummah to this idea that we need to bring the Caliphate back. I see somebody in the chat is having problem with audio. Maybe suggest to use Chrome. And if he says is using Firefox, maybe let them know that use another browser and to see if it's working for them, right? So let's go to the rise of political Islam. This is something that I have a problem with, because every time we say political Islam, it kind of suggests that Islam is not political and political Islam is separate from Islam. And every time I study the Quran and Hadith, my understanding of it is that politics is an inseparable part of Islam, so there's no way dividing it. But given that in our discourse, a lot of people do separate political Islam and Islam, let's just understand at least their definition, and then we could move from there. So this is how other people see it. They say Islam as a faith is just the belief in Allah and Muhammad as his messenger. Allah as God and Muhammad as his messenger. Okay. And the belief that the Quran is the direct word of God. That's Islam as a faith. And then you do pray, you do the Shahadatain, you do Salah. So basically, some rituals and some beliefs, a mix of beliefs and rituals in your personal life. That's Islam, right? And then they separate that from political Islam or Islamism. And they say that Islamism is the use of Islam as a political ideology to seize power and integrates religion and governance. And again, to be fair, when I read the Quran, I see why Islam is the people who we consider Islamists. I see their point, right? Because it's actually the command of Allah to be political, to go for governing, and basically say that it's the commandment of Allah to rule Islamically. And if you don't aim to bring Islamic rule back, if you deny that that is the commandment of Allah, denying a commandment of Allah is something that you could get takfired over. Means that you could be considered a non-Muslim because you're denying a commandment of Allah. That's a position of somebody that is an Islamist, somebody like Sayyid Qutb, right? Islamist is actually something that is by Muslim Brotherhood to differentiate themselves from secular nationalists like Gamal Abdel Nasser. You were asking in the chat regarding the Pan-Arabists. Their hero was Gamal Abdel Nasser. He was a man that was going to bring them the glory of an Arab empire. And he was a socialist. He was very secular. And if you could even see speeches of him on YouTube making fun of hijab, like very old black and white videos. Jamal Abdel Nasser was a leader in Egypt. basically the leader of this Pan-Arabist movement. And if you go on YouTube and look at one of his speeches, about just look on YouTube, say Jamal Abdel Nasser hijab. Okay, there's a crowd in front of him, and he's speaking, and he's making fun of this person because he came and told him that he needs to make hijab mandatory in Egypt. And then he said, "Your daughter is without hijab. How could you ask me to force an entire nation to wear hijab where you can't even make your own daughter wear the hijab?" And the entire crowd laughs, right? So you can see that these are not Islamically minded people. These are very secular, very nationalistic to a point, because it might seem like we're calling them secular nationalists, but I don't know if I would use that term, because they wanted to unite Arab nations and then get rid of them and turn them into an Arab empire, right? So Muslim Brotherhood was against all of these people. It was against Pan Arabism, these secular socialist nationalist people. And Muslim Brotherhood at that time, these Pan Arabists were basically their main enemy. And the Pan Arabists were targeting them, arresting them, executing them. The, there was a war between the Muslim Brotherhood. So this goes way back before we have the Muslim Brotherhood today. So there's a lot of, so the Pan Arabists were in power. So it's hard to imagine that right now, because we don't see the Pan Arabists anywhere, and we see the Islamists in power, right? At least with their militias. If you go back in time, back in the day, Muslim Brotherhood was constantly being hunted down by Pan Arabists because they were the ones ruling, right? So Pan Islamism, the goal is to unite, back in the day and until now. And again, Pan-Islamism is not just Muslim Brotherhood. Pan-Islamism is Muslim Brotherhood, is ISIS, is Al Qaeda. It's not the Taliban, because the Taliban is more locally focused. The Taliban doesn't have an ambition to bring back a global caliphate. The Taliban's ambitions are basically in Afghanistan, Pakistan region, right? But ISIS, Al Qaeda, Muslim Brotherhood, they are pan Islamists. They are trying to unite all Muslims globally under one caliphate to re-establish their Islamic might that they had before. If you look at the Oxford Encyclopedia definitions, you can see it says that it defines it, that it calls it a comprehensive union of all Muslims and solidarity under one caliph. And some people also call it caliphatism, which is basically belief in one caliph for all Muslims. Now, what is jihadism? Jihadism is the idea that to get the ummah united under one caliph and bring back a caliphate and establish Islamic rule over entire regions, the way to get there is with jihad. So if you believe the tool to achieve this is jihad, then that is called jihadism. So Islamism and then jihadism. So after World War, so this was after the World War. Now let's look at what happened. Let's go a little bit further down in history. So after the Cold War, political Islam has grown because of the failures of Pan-Arabism, thanks to Israel mostly. Pan-Islamism is now growing significantly. A lot of people had their hopes. A lot of people who were anti the concept of nation states. So you have basically, if you look in the region, people who were more Western minded or liberal or progressive, they wanted the idea of nation states. And then people who wanted to bring back like become a great global power, they had a pan-Arabist mindset. But because of the failure of Jamal Abdel Nasser and the success of Israel, the reputation of pan-Arabism died significantly. younger people who were interested in becoming a powerful global entity. Pan-Islamism seemed to be more interesting because of the failures of Pan-Arabism. After the Cold War, when you see the Soviet, because the main challenge at that time to Western powers were Soviet power, right? And after the Cold War, there was a huge power vacuum opposing the West. A lot of people thought that the fall of the Soviet Union was the end of history and it's over. Western values, classical liberal values, the hegemony of Western powers is going to take over and nothing will ever be able to challenge it again. We are at the end of history and this is over. All the enemies of these ideas that was born right around the French Revolution and then put in place around the world after World War II with the fall of the Soviet Union. All the last remaining challenges, these ideas and methods are not going to take place everywhere. And that's it. There's no more war, no more struggle, no more competition. And it's going to be like this till the end of time. Right? That was some people's ideas. And yeah, somebody in the chat is saying that sounds naive. It was extremely naive because that power vacuum was filled with political Islam. As Bernard Lewis actually also mentioned, international pan-Islamism started to grow, and political Islam replaced Soviet power. And this is very interesting because if you look at academic studies, this is around the time that you see a shift in Soviet studies in geopolitics towards political Islam. There were so many academic papers, studies, and books focused on Soviet studies. Right around this time, you could see a shift towards political Islam because the next challenge, replacing that power to the West, was political Islam, at least in that region. Islam became the post Cold War alternative to Western dominance. And we have some scholars here like Peter Demont, if I'm pronouncing his name accurately. He said he describes Islamism as the only universal and assertive challenge to Western supremacy. And then we have Muqtadar Khan, another scholar, saying Islamism threatens Western economic and political interests, especially US hegemony in the Middle East. Other scholars identify Islam as a political religion unlike Christianity, which we will actually talk about. Yeah, so let's actually look at the timeline of some of this. So from and how we went from Pan-Arabism to Pan-Islamism, right? So from the 1930s to the 1960s, we had Pan-Arabism. And Pan-Arabism mostly came in two shapes: Nasserism and Baathism. Nasserism is basically after Gamal Abdel Nasser in Egypt, and Baathism is named after the Baath Party in Iraq and Syria. From the 1930s to the 1960s, Pan-Arabism overshadowed Islamism in the forms of Nasserism and Baathism. For example, Saddam, it was part of the Baath Party, or like in Syria, right? But after 1967, so what happened in 1967? We had Israel's defeat of all these. For Pan-Arabism to succeed, Israel should have been removed because Israel was the in Pan-Arabist perspective, Israel. This is the reason behind the birth of the Palestinian resistance. The Palestinian resistance has nothing to do with creating Palestine as a nation state. The whole point of the Palestinian resistance was to remove the Western power in the region, because for the Pan-Arabists, the entire reason why Israel exists in the Middle East is to block a Pan-Arabist empire taking place. In the mind of a Pan-Arabist, if we actually create this Pan-Arabist empire, we will be a threat to West. We will be a power like the Soviet Union was and a challenge to the West. We will become our own political bloc. Because the West cannot handle that, that's why they came and created Israel. And with Israel present here, That's basically America right in the middle of our empire to be. And we cannot create this empire while this cancerous tumor is right here in the middle. So the goal is, before let's just get united, remove Israel, and when we remove Israel, we could basically make this whole Pan-Arabist empire. And they all got united and tried to attack Israel and remove it multiple times, and they were defeated by just Israel. It was very humiliating. Being defeated by multiple Arab countries uniting and attacking this tiny country that is very young, very new, and being defeated by it is very embarrassing. A huge part of the Pan Arabist attitude is about being strong, right? The whole reason why you're trying to build an empire is because these people are having a crisis of identity, comparing themselves to the West and thinking that they're weak and the West is strong. So you want to show strength. So you having a whole bunch of countries attacking a tiny little country and being defeated by it, it basically destroys a lot of support for what you're trying to stand for. 1967 and Camp David in 1978 was a huge defeat for Arab nationalism. And this was basically the defeat of Pan Arabism. And ever since then, Pan Arabism has gone down. And this was an opportunity for Islamism to resurge and grow, filling the vacuum caused by the decline of Pan Arabism, right? And then we have Asif Bayat. These are some scholars. He described Islamism as a dynamic movement organizing through mosques and grassroots activism. This is one of the strengths of Islamic movements. The mosque network is a very powerful, dynamic network that makes it very flexible. Iran also experienced this. When it comes to these other movements like Pan Arabism, you're talking about generals, presidents, prime ministers, and you have a top down organizational approach. But when it comes to Islamism, it's more of a grassroots activism, different mosques working as networks. So it's a lot more dynamic, it's a lot more flexible. For example, we also had this experience in 1979 in Iran in the revolution. You could see how these networks of mosques made it very easy for them to mobilize, network, and organize everything. The whole Islamism movement has learned from its experience living under Pan Arabists and how to grow in the shadows. To this day, they benefit from that experience. I will let you guys come up and ask questions after I'm done with this. I'm going to try to go through this quicker so that anybody who has a question can come up and ask. So another scholar here is saying Islamic groups legitimize themselves by following the Prophet's model and orthodox purity. They have something to use as a reason, as a reference point. So like Pan Arabists didn't have that. Like so Pan Arabists didn't have something that they could refer to for something that we're bringing back, right? But the Pan Islamists could always point to Muhammad ruling over Yathrib, and given that Muhammad is supposed to be the role model for all Muslims at all times, Muhammad's ruling is used as a role model and to legitimize their movement, right? So we have scholars. They define Islamic revival as a discourse of nostalgia, basically regret over loss of power and glory, right? And I think that we could, me as a Iranian and many people as Jews know what this feels like, right? So given that the Islamic empires were something, really big at some point. I mean, some people refer to some of it as the Islamic golden age, like during the Abbasid dynasty, especially where they were at their height of their power. And there's so many people know that the Islamic empires, Islamic caliphates used to be very big, very rich, very powerful, and center of a lot of economic activity and commerce and armies. So, given that that was in their past, a lot of people have nostalgia, and this is basically resembling how many Iranians, many Persians, especially look at how the Iran was an empire at some point, and they look at their country as weak right now, and they have that nostalgia. The Iranians experience two types of nostalgia: one when Iran was an empire, and two during the Pahlavi dynasty. So we have more recent nostalgia where Iranians look at their Pahlavi dynasty, which I think that's more common. But we also have some Iranians thinking like, "Oh my God, how did we went from being an empire to just now being one of the poorest, weakest countries in the world?" So there's that, and also Jews had that nostalgia. They don't have it anymore. Unlike the Muslims and Iranians, the Jews had nostalgia because they lost Israel against all odds. The Jews are actually, I think, the only people that managed to bring back what they had, maybe even better. Maybe we Iranians will also be able to bring back what we had, at least not the empire, but at least what we had, something resembling during the Pahlavi dynasty. But the Jews managed to bring Israel back, but even better because Israel before used to be part of empires and it was never independent. And now they managed to bring a better Israel back, which has its own independence, right? The Jews used to have nostalgia over what it was before. They always sang next year in Jerusalem, but now they don't have to sing that because they are in Jerusalem. The difference between what the Persians are experiencing and what the Jews are experiencing and what the Islamists are experiencing is that Jews wanted to bring back something that is local, right? It's not an empire, and Iranians want to bring back the Pahlavi. I mean, we have some pan-Iranists that maybe want to bring back an empire, but those are few. We do have most Iranians just want to go back to something like before the Islamic Republic was in power. These are local ambitions, right? Like the Jews didn't have an ambition to take over half the world or bring back the empire. There's no ambition to bring back an empire. A nation state is fine. The Iranians also just have local ambitions. They're not trying to bring back an empire. Most of them don't. They just want to be a nation state, but without the Islamic Republic, right? But the difference is that the ambition of Islamists is not to bring back a nation state because they have nation states. So the nostalgia they have is for their empire, a caliphate, right? So it's basically ours is local, theirs is global. And then also we could compare it to Christianity. I don't think Christianity is experiencing this discourse of nostalgia, at least not yet. Maybe with the rise of leftism, I see some Christians talking about the rise of Islam in the West and the rise of progressive leftists' value in the West is making Christians nostalgic over before times that before this, and they think that many of this is because of Christianity not being taken seriously. So Christians didn't have the sense of nostalgia, especially given that their countries were advancing more than other countries in the past 100 years or so, but now they're experiencing that a little bit because of rise of leftist values and Islamic values in their own country. Christianity is also global like Islam. However, it's not global politically. It doesn't dream of like a Christian body politically dominating a known part of the world. It is global like Islam, but it's personal. Its global spread is in people's homes. Not it's not about bringing a Christian empire. Like I don't know many Christians are interested in creating a Christian empire. So that's the difference between Islamism and Christianity. It's more personal, and it basically goes back to the roots and to the DNA because Jesus never ruled and Muhammad did, right? So Muslim nostalgia functions as a connection to past greatness and building collective identity under the ummah and resistance against the West, right? They want to be the main power against the West. So what's the goal? To recreate Islamic civilization and the golden age, especially between the 8th and 13th centuries. The Muslims see the Ummah as one community that needs to be more united, like they're yearning for unity. Basically, it seemed like they have a diaspora. The Muslims are just spread all across the globe, and they're just practicing Islam in their own local areas and their own personal lives. This is not what Islam is about. These should not be separate people in different places. There needs to be a unity between all these Muslims for one thing at the same time. And they constantly complain about the Ummah's failure to unite. The Islamists constantly complain about that, and they call Muslims orphans of the Ummah. So you have so many Quranic verses. There's Quran. You have Quran 839 that talks about the fact that we have to fight until all religion is for Allah. We have Quran 21 107, which says Muhammad is as a mercy to all the worlds, like the entire world, not just a part of the world. So you can see the ambition for global dominance comes from the Quran and also Hadith itself. Islamists look at the Quran and make the case that they have the point. We have many declarations from many Islamic bodies around the world that says Islam is not just a religion, it's a world order. So this is not a competition between religions, it's not a competition between different cultures, for different philosophies. It's so much more. The way you need to look at all of this is that this is a fight between world orders. So we're not talking about, oh, we think you should pray like this. You think secularism is good. We think secularism is bad. It's much more than that. It's about the Western model, the modern Republican tradition that we have all around the world. We have nation states, we have parliaments, we have presidents and prime ministers, we have elections, we have separations of power in the form of judiciary branch, the executive branch, and the legislative branch. You can see this model everywhere. This is a Western model born out of the American Revolution. This is a world order that has dominated the world and is working. It's working, and Islam is challenging that. So the Islamism especially is challenging that. Islamism is not challenging Islamism is not about challenging Christianity, atheism, or Judaism. Islamism is mostly about challenging that specific thing. And they think that model was forced upon them in the Sykes-Picot Agreement upon their land. Like, okay, if that's your model, you forced this upon our land. Now we have parliaments, we have nation states, we have these borders. These are Western models. And not only we are going to remove these models from our land, we are going to come and force our model upon your land, like the Islamic Caliphate. So if you look at everything as a war between world orders, it makes more sense than if you look at this as just different cultures, different ideologies, different philosophies. It's an entire way to run politics, right? Yes. Okay. So last thing I want to say, let's just step one step back and look at this, zoom out and look at this from the top down, right? We had the French Revolution. Before the French Revolution, we had some great thinkers like John Locke and Hobbes. These people and many others brought the age of enlightenment and they introduced some ideas. And then we saw the French Revolution, and the French Revolution basically was the first attempt of putting these ideas into practice. And ever since the French Revolution, we had the nation state model fighting against the empire model ever since the French Revolution, right? Everything you're seeing right now is a continuation of that competition. Before the French Revolution, our entire history of civilization was basically the age of empires, right? We have more than 10,000 years of the age of empires, meaning the world could be divided into three groups. You were either the empire or a colony of the empire, or you were the barbarians. These were the three things you could be. With the French Revolution, we had the new model of the nation state. And ever since then, we're moving from the age of empires to the age of nation states. Especially after the end of Cold War, the age of empires were completely gone and the age of nation states has completely taken over. My prediction for the future is that at some point, the age of nation states is going to give away and the age of network states is going to take its place. But that's a discussion for another time. Right now, we're living in the age of nation states. However, the empire strikes back. The age of empires sometimes tries to make a comeback, right? You could see Putin's attack on Ukraine as a continuation of this fight. Maybe we're too naive to think that the age of empires are over. Maybe we thinking that this is the age of nation states and this is going to be how it is. We shouldn't be too sure about that. Maybe empire might want to is making an attempt of returning, right? So this what you're seeing right now, the Caliphate, the Pan-Islamism is an attempt of bringing empire back. However, this empire is called the Caliphate. And we also have another Islamic empire called an Imamate, the Shia version of this, which will be a topic for another webinar. Let me know if you're interested in that. But all of everything you're seeing is an attack on the cause of the world order within the framework of nation states. If you are fighting against a nation state, what you're fighting against is the current world order, which is modern Western liberal order. By the way, every time we say liberal, please don't think leftist. We're talking about classical liberal values. What we're trying to learn here with this community is how to best understand these concepts and how to best preserve the current framework. Our goal is to learn how we can preserve the current framework because the current framework works. When you see poverty dropping at a rate that we've never seen in the history of civilization before, when you see science and technology progress at a rate that we've never seen before, when you see more stability, more peace, less war than we've ever seen before, when we see prosperity and well-being increasing, when we see more mothers get to live with their children instead of burying half of them before they age 5, when you see people having access to more clean water, more medicine, more healthcare, when you see people living much longer lives and higher quality lives than ever before, all of this is possible because of this current framework that we have achieved. So it makes sense for us to do whatever we can to preserve it. And that requires us knowing what threatens it and fighting back against it. All right. So that was that. Any questions, anybody? You could raise your hand.